Okay, we're going to start our 4 o'clock session very shortly. If people could please take their seats, especially our speakers. Grab your coffee, grab your drink, and we're going to start our session on multi-stakeholder partnerships. What I'd like to do in terms of speaking on it, if you don't mind, start with you, because you're a kind of macro view across all sectors. And then I'd like to stick within the order. So then go to sort of food. The idea is we have different perspectives from different sectors. So we go to food systems, then we go to technology, then we'll go finance, and then fashion.
Yeah, I mean, we're more business with input from NGOs.
Yeah, but it's across all sectors.
All sectors, yeah.
Yeah,
all sectors of business.
All sectors.
Because when people say sectors, they think civil society,
Oh, I
NGOs.
see. Right, yeah, all business sectors. GICS industry code. Okay. So this one will work if the handhelds fail. So that's our backstop. That you don't need to turn these on or off. They stay on.
But I meant
So
I'm
it's hot mic all the time. Now I'm going to do something rude. I'm going to stand in front of you because that camera is doing our live stream. Yeah, and we have a few live streams. This has been promoted. So I have to stand here, otherwise the acoustics go strange. So sorry if I'm turning my back to you, and then I'll move out of the picture. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the GEF session today, exploring the dynamic of multi-stakeholder partnerships and how they can support the transformative agenda to becoming nature positive and net zero. My name is Matthew Reddy. I'm the Senior Private Sector Specialist with the Global Environment Facility, and this afternoon hosting from the GEF panel here at CBD Montreal COP15. So it's my pleasure to introduce our panel today. Each of the panelists has been selected because they represent an industry sector and a multi-stakeholder or engaged in multi-stakeholder partnerships that have made commitments to being nature positive and or net zero. And what we want to do today in the session is really explore, how are these multi-stakeholder partnerships formed? Understand the transformative agenda and what the role of these platforms is in galvanizing nature positive action, especially among the private sector. We'll look at how the priority actions are determined for multi-stakeholder platforms, and then how do we keep it real? How do we avoid this sometimes accusation of greenwash and set realistic, credible targets, report and manage these? And we're going to explore these through a number of sectors today. We have fashion, we have finance, we have technology, we have food systems, and then a broad view of multi-industry sectors with Business for Nature. So I'd like to introduce our panel. So we have, first of all, on the left, Katie Russell, who is the Director of Corporate Partnerships, Brand and Communications with Conservation International, representing the fashion sector. We're delighted that Laurence Pessez from BNP Paribas is here joining us from the finance sector, and Laurence is the Global Head of CSR with BNP Paribas. We have Eva Zabey, who's the Executive Director of Business for Nature, a huge multi-stakeholder platform. And of course we have Tim Christophersen from Salesforce, representing technology, and is a VP of Climate Action. And then representing food systems, Victoria Crawford from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD, who is the Senior Manager for Investment Partnerships. So I'd like to take a sort of macro view, first of all, and perhaps, Eva, if we could ask you, what's BFN doing? How are you structured as a multi-stakeholder platform, and what's the aim? Why are people coming to BFN?
Thanks so much, Matt. Well, Business for Nature is a global coalition. We now have 78 partner organizations, 3/4 of which are business organizations from around the world, and it's great to see a number here. But we also have a small number of conservation organizations that have a track record of working with business. And that's super important because it keeps our ambition high and makes sure we're really grounded in the science. So the way, our aim, I should start with, is to demonstrate business leadership and momentum on nature. And initially we were set up in 2019 to advocate for an ambitious global biodiversity framework here at COP15. So of course we were set up middle of 2019 expecting to run full blast for just over a year because COP15 was going to be in October. Now what's happened is, obviously with the delays, we've managed actually to create even more momentum and leadership. And instead of just one big campaign, we've done 4 campaigns on different topics. So you were asking about how we're set up and how we work. So the way we're set up is we have our partner organizations. These are not companies, they're business organizations like the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, World Economic Forum, International Chamber of Commerce. And we 12 of them act as our decision-making body that we call the coordination group. We also have something called the Strategic Advisory Group of leading companies, and Tim sits on that at Salesforce. They are our sounding board. So when we are developing policy asks or when we need to represent a strong business voice to share their experience, our Strategic Advisory Group are the ones we're going to go to first. Christina, also from Suzanne, is in the room here, so also on our Strategic Advisory Group. And but what we're always balancing between making sure we're demonstrating leadership, but also the momentum part is important, and that means we need to offer opportunities for a wide range of companies to engage with us. And we did that initially through our call to action, Nature is Everyone's Business, which is a very simple set of statements that ultimately just says that companies understand we've got to halt and reverse nature loss, and they're calling for ambitious policy. And more than 1,100 companies now have signed up to that from all different sectors, from all different geographies, and that gives us some evidence that companies want to engage on this agenda. So maybe I'll stop there because I could talk for absolutely hours about it, but did I miss one of your questions or enough?
I think it's really important that you mentioned the diversity of stakeholders that you have and the governance structure. I think that's super important. But what's the target? What's the objective? You've got the 4 campaigns. What's it all heading to?
Well, up until now, our main priority has been to influence this meeting, this COP15, for an ambitious outcome, global biodiversity framework. You may have heard that our primary campaign is to make it mandatory for all large and transnational companies to assess and disclose their impact and dependency on nature. Right now, the discussions in Target 15 are ongoing. I don't know if anyone's got the latest. It's worse than a football match. There's it's very exciting. It's very exciting, but let's see. There is quite a lot of strong support for it in the negotiating room. But let's see if that goes through. But number one was, and the reason, though, I should say, that we need to make assessment and disclosure mandatory for large companies is because we need the information to make better decisions, whether we're from government, consumers, investors, and businesses themselves. And right now, if it's just voluntary, in fact, to be perfectly honest, nothing's going to change as much unless there is a willingness. So that's why we've got to have that step change and that political signal. Maybe I'll stop now.
No, you've drilled it into your partners and your signatories really well, because every time there's a panel over there, someone always says, they wedge in, make it mandatory, make it mandatory. So I think
that's a real live example of how we work.
Right. So the power of harmonizing that message.
And not overdoing the messages. So because it's a very complicated world here, especially within this conference center. So, you know, we also help simplify a bit in terms of and prioritize where some of the key elements are.
Very good. Now we're going to turn now to one of the, I guess, probably one of the oldest multi-stakeholder platforms, which is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It in itself is a platform of partnerships. And we have Victoria Crawford here, who is leading a lot of the innovative work in food systems. And perhaps, Victoria, you could tell us a little bit about how WBCSD is organising its work on food systems and these innovative partnerships where the private sector is leading.
Yes, happy to, and thank you, Matt. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a business membership organisation. We exist to work with and support multinational companies largely to meet sustainability targets and contribute to the SDGs. I'm going to give an example of one specific project which we run, which is called the Sustainable Rice Landscapes Initiative. And this is an example of how WBCSD partners with a range of other organizations, I guess all platforms in their own right as well, in order to accelerate the transition to more sustainable forms of rice production. So why are we focusing on rice? Rice is a crop which feeds half of the world's population as its daily staple. 144 million smallholders rely on it for their livelihoods. But at the same time, rice production has a huge environmental impact. So it has the same carbon footprint as the aviation industry because of methane that comes off the fields in its production. And it uses 40% of the world's irrigation water. And what that means is that as rice expands into greater areas of land, we see less water available for nature more broadly, and a whole range of impacts on nature, climate, and on people's livelihoods. So it's really an example of this coming together of these three interrelated challenges of biodiversity in nature, climate change, and inequality. The other interesting thing about rice is it's actually quite easy to produce it in a way that has a much, much smaller environmental footprint. So by drying the fields rather than leaving them standing underwater, by using new forms of new seeds, better use of inputs, from a technical perspective, actually quite easy to massively reduce the environmental impact of rice production. Yet really, rice doesn't get anything like the focus that it needs. So a few years ago, we came together with 5 other organizations, so WBCSD representing the private sector, but also UN Environment Programme, FAO, IRRI, the International Rice Research Institute, GIZ, and the Sustainable Rice Platform, which has a standard for sustainable rice and has some kind of quite clear information about what types of production have a much less impact. And by working together, we have managed to raise the profile of rice. Obviously, this is still an ongoing challenge and much more work to be done. But really, it's by having this kind of joint voice of these different organizations representing different sectors that has enabled us to work effectively. In particular, like one good example is in securing a lot of support from the GEF to fund rice projects that are helping farmers adopt more sustainable practices. So the overall aim of this initiative is about getting farmers to adopt practices that are in line with the Sustainable Rice Platform's standard for sustainable rice. But I guess like how we do that is by mobilizing finance through the GEF. So through GEF funding, I think we've had 80 million worth of support into 8 countries, which has then mobilized $650 million worth of additional finance. But also other aims are about kind of knowledge sharing across countries, between these different projects, across these different organizations, about supporting the private sector to include rice in their strategies to meet their net zero and nature positive targets. So that's how we work together as a group of 6 organizations representing different stakeholder groups to accelerate this topic that often doesn't get as much attention as we feel it warrants.
So that's something to consider next time you eat a bowl of Cocoa Pops. And it's good actually that you mentioned water, because I see Jane Madgwick here from Wetlands International, and you know, rice paddies themselves are classed as wetlands. Am I correct there, Jane? Yeah. And by allowing more water into those critical river systems of Southeast Asia, you know, we can improve e-flows and improve the functioning of wetlands ecosystems and the biodiversity. It's a very multifaceted initiative. The next person we'd like to invite to speak is in fact coming from the technology space. So Salesforce, an incredible organisation with an untapped or starting to be tapped potential, a superpower, you could say, Tim. And you have a wide number of initiatives being led and driven by Salesforce right the way through the organisation. Perhaps you can share with us, why is a technology company doing this?
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Before I talk about one of the world's largest technology companies, allow me a personal reflection on the title of this session. So multi-stakeholder partnerships in transforming economic systems, that alone packs a lot of punch to become nature positive, which in itself, again, is yet another big box to unpack. I want to focus on the multi-stakeholder. In my career over the last almost 25 years, I've always worked on this topic of nature and climate. I've worked for a government, for the European Union, for the United Nations, for an NGO, and now for the private sector. So the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships includes that all these sectors speak a different language, have a different code of conduct, a different culture, and unless we really try to come together and understand each other, we will not succeed. So what is happening, for example, at this COP is super important. And I used to work for the CBD Secretariat. I was supporting the negotiations in Nagoya. I'm so excited by this COP. My only wish is that we had this kind of energy and business participation in 2010. So then I believe the Aichi targets would have taken a different turn. So I'm very hopeful with the business participation here, and a big shout out to Business for Nature. They keep us all very organized. Salesforce does support the Make It Mandatory campaign. We also have publicly available on our website nature policy priorities. So when I speak both in closed door meetings with governments, but also on stages like this, I feel very comfortable to say, of course, we need to reform our fiscal incentive system in the world. It cannot be that we spend $1.8 trillion to make fossil fuels cheaper and more abundantly available, to produce more pesticides, more synthetic fertilizers. These things have to stop, and they have to reform. And there's a lot of good things we can invest in that will create hundreds of millions of jobs for the green renewable energy, for regenerative agriculture. So having these kinds of policy priorities is something that I hope other companies can also pick up. Now, why is Salesforce here, and what does a global technology company do for nature? So we are still exploring this space. We've just done our full nature impact and dependencies assessment. We haven't published it yet, but we are developing our nature positive strategy. We wanted to see what comes out of COP15 here until we finalize it. And I think the thing we're mostly observing here and trying to figure out is this hidden superpower of Salesforce. So we have 150,000 customers globally, mostly corporations, but also about 50,000 NGOs. So helping these customers and also SMEs who don't have sustainability teams and nature teams and climate experts to enter the alphabet soup that we are concocting here with ISSB and GRI and TNFD and EFRAG and ISO and who wants to add a few? SBTN, thank you. Who understands all that stuff out there if you're not a specialist? We have to make the entry level more accessible for companies, and technology is, of course, a super useful tool for doing that. We already do that for climate. We have a tool called Net Zero Cloud, which makes emission reporting easier and faster for companies. Hopefully, nature will also offer an opportunity to do that at some point, to just allow companies to first understand what their footprint is, how they can address it, where they have to invest to ensure their impact is lowered. If they want to contribute to a nature positive world, which is not something we recommend you make a company goal, being a nature positive company is not something that is either achievable nor useful, because it has to be an all of society effort that includes policy and multi-stakeholder partnership to become a nature positive world. But if you want to contribute to that as a company, you first have to understand what your impact is, what your dependencies are on nature, and then how you can invest to contribute to nature positive.
Very, very good, Tim. Now, where is this direction coming from within Salesforce? Where is this big push coming from within your organization?
So I have to admit I have a fairly easy time convincing the board and the CEO, because our co-founder and CEO, Mark Benioff, is, I think he's almost a corporate activist, I would say, because he wrote a book called Trailblazer, Business is the Greatest Platform for Change. He co-founded the Trillion Trees Initiative and has its own Benioff Ocean Initiative. We have an ocean sustainability program as part of my team. So I think if I had to explain that to my board and CEO, it might take longer, but these things are happening in other companies as well. So in this case, in our case, it comes from the top. In other companies that we work with, it comes more from the bottom or from the chief sustainability officers and their teams. What I observed this year in Davos, I was in Davos in May, is that sustainability revolution is now in the boardrooms and with the CEOs, which is a big difference, because lots of companies have sustainability teams, but it has hit the boardrooms, has hit the CEO level and the CFO level, which again is why mandatory disclosure is so important, because we have to now create a level playing field to ensure everybody not only enters this space, but also sticks with it, because this is a marathon and not a sprint that we're entering.
I think that's a great point, that leadership in organizations can really change the way whole of organizations work and collaborate with one another. And indeed, perhaps that might well be the change that we've seen from 2010 with the Aichi targets, and now this whole awareness and recognition into the boardrooms of the biggest businesses in the world. Nothing happens without money. We've had this discussion quite a lot, haven't we, about improving resource mobilization, and of course the private sector is one of those areas very much in the focus for improving this flow of capital. So at the moment you could probably say the flow of capital is rather uphill to biodiversity. So how do we get the capital to flow somewhat downhill? And BNP Paribas I think, well recognised as one of the leading financial institutions globally, very forward-thinking, and we're delighted that Laurence can be here today and explain a little bit about the sort of initiatives that BNP is involved with and the type of activities that you expect to be carrying forward in your strategy for biodiversity.
Thank you, Matt. Yes, I can share a few words about the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a platform gathering representatives for the private sectors, corporates and consultancy firms, for example, NGOs, WWF, Global Canopy, to name a few, and also public bodies. So the idea was to put everyone around the table in order to produce a reporting framework, because of course we need a mandatory reporting, but not any kind of reporting. We need something with a commonly agreed framework, comparable, consistent, addressing both risks and opportunities, also disclosing the strategy to mitigate the risks, in order for the financial institutions to know where they stand, what's in their portfolio, how can they measure progress, what's the baseline. So it was created at the beginning by a bunch of convinced people, as usual, and now it has really gained momentum. It has already been mentioned during COP by Mark Carney, Emmanuel Faber as a reference, and it has not yet released a final version. So it's already a great success, and I think one of the tricks why is it already a success, it's that it works really very transparently. It has released successive batch of drafts, each time very open consultation, everybody being invited to give a feedback, and there have been also targeted consultations with dedicated groups of stakeholders on the most sensitive sectors, for example, with oil and gas players, with the agricultural sector, textile, etc. And today, for example, there was a consultation with indigenous people and local communities in order for them to provide a feedback, express their concerns. So it's a very iterative process. And I think it's a key for the framework to be adopted in the future, but as many people, as many bodies as possible.
So let's have a quick show of hands amongst the panel here. How many of your organisations are involved in the piloting of TNFD? So, yeah, okay, yeah, interesting. And in the room, sorry, let's have a hands up in the room piloting T. Okay, yeah. So this is quite a good impact, isn't it? So and of course, Jeff. One of the anchor investors in TNFD, and we're really pleased to see these hands go up in the room. That really justifies the work that we're doing. So I'd like to turn now to fashion and the work that the Fashion Pact is doing. And we have Katie here from Conservation International, who's going to talk to us about this initiative across the fashion sector.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And thank you to the GEF. You guys have been really great partners, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of this incredible panel here today. So again, my name is Katie. I work for Conservation International. We are a global environmental nonprofit whose goal is to really protect nature for the benefit of humanity. And, we know that we can't do that alone. We need partners. And we have worked with everyone. We work with communities, we work with governments, but we also work with business. And since our founding in the 80s, Peter Seligman really championed this idea of bringing businesses to the table. And Eva, you said it perfectly. Nature's everyone's business. And so understanding, that yes, there is business impacts on nature, but also the ability for business to be able to drive scale and to do it quickly really aligns with the urgency that we need to solve a lot of our problems. And so we've been working with the food and agricultural space now for a couple decades, really pioneering some things there. But what we wanted to do is apply it to a new sector that has a lot of impact. And that's how we landed on fashion. And, thinking about fashion, it's really unique in that fashion and biodiversity and nature they're fundamentally linked. So yes, we get the fibers from from nature that creates the clothes, but nature also inspires fashion. The colors, the textures, the patterns, everything that we get has been inspiring fashion design for centuries. And so despite that, fashion industry has a huge impact on nature. They're actually, their CO2 emissions are greater than the combination of shipping and air travel combined. Their processing, the dyeing of materials has been linked to water pollution all around the world. And agricultural-based products like leather have been big drivers of deforestation. And so looking at all of those impacts, we knew we wanted to partner with this industry to drive actual change. And we looked across the landscape, and there are a lot of really good individual companies doing a lot of great work, and that's great. That's great. Speak up. Oh, no. Okay. So we looked a lot across the landscape, and there are a lot of individual companies doing a lot of good work, and that's great. But if they succeed and the other company down the road fails, we all still fail. So we really wanted to work with a multi-stakeholder group to really drive that needle for true industry change. And in 2019, we partnered with the Fashion Pact, which is a global coalition of textile and fashion companies that was actually mandated by French President Macron at the 2019 G7 summit. Since then, they've grown over to 200 brands. It's all the big ones you can think of. It's H&M, it's Nike, it's Adidas, Burberry, Kering. Kering was actually the big founder member of this. And they all came together and decided to commit to 3 pillars of work, 3 environmental goals. The first is around climate, the second one is around biodiversity, and the third is around oceans. And so Conservation International, as the official biodiversity partner of the Fashion Pact, our goal is to really bring this coalition, bring the industry together to make sure that we're having a better impact for a healthier planet. And thanks to the GEF, we actually got some seed funding to really start that work. So what we've been doing over the last couple years is really designing the policies, the tools, the analyses that these companies need to set science-based targets for nature in their biodiversity strategies. And I'm just curious, how many people are familiar with SBTN? And okay, great. So that is also another multi-stakeholder coalition that we love. And Conservation International, we've been a partner of theirs for quite some time. We co-lead the Land Hub, the Biodiversity Hub, soon to be the Oceans Hub. We sit on their corporate engagement program. And so, we've really invested a lot of science and capacity there. And with the Fashion Pact work, which is great, what we're able to do is bring all of that guidance from SBTN as it's coming out and give it to the Fashion Pact, this giant coalition of Fashion Pact members. And it also goes 2 ways. So the GEF funding also helped us road test some methodologies, some targets on actual fashion supply chain data, and having that constant feedback loop to make sure that those targets are actually workable with corporate data is really, really, really important. And it also, is really going to be crucial to help the sector be ready to set those science-based targets once they are available, hopefully early next year.
Thank you so much for mentioning targets. And it was really encouraging that everyone put up their hands there on the science-based targets. That's quite wonderful. So we're going to sort of open up a little bit now, and I'd like to ask one question before we open it up for some questions from the audience. Obviously an expert audience, so this will give us a good opportunity to have a bit of dialogue with the people on the stage. So we've talked about membership of multi-stakeholder partnerships, right? So there maybe was a philosophy a few years ago that you sort of raise the bar, that, you have these leading companies and you make them, pioneers in a space. Over time, people thought, well, we're not really addressing the challenges and the real laggards in the sector. How might we lift the bottom? And so there are companies that are leading, there are companies that need help, or companies that perhaps haven't had the legacy of good leadership in management. So how do we deal in your multi-stakeholder platforms of who's in, who's out? What's your philosophy of how to deal with a whole of industry sector? Anyone can answer.
I can go first since I'm holding the mic still, I guess. Yeah, so for the Fashion Pact, it's a CEO-led coalition. And so what that means is in order to join, you have to have a commitment for your CEO. He or she has to sign a document saying that I am committing to these environmental goals across biodiversity, across climate, and across oceans. And you know, I think having that buy-in from the top is really crucial to make sure that those companies actually have the capacity and the resources to deliver on those targets that they've set. And our SteerCo is also made up of all CEOs, and so they're really the ones setting that agenda. We also have kind of two pathways of action that we do in the Fashion Pact. The first is the collective action. So if we're talking about biodiversity, our goal again is to really set biodiversity strategies that are aligned with SBTN, but also to combat deforestation or commit to zero deforestation in fashion supply chains by 2025. And then we also have these joint actions. So how do we get individual companies who may be more in tune to a specific issue or a specific place, how do we get them all together and really drive that action? And with funding from the GEF, we're doing some joint actions in sustainable cashmere, sustainable gold, and sustainable leather. So kind of having that buy-in where you get to, you know, first make sure that you've got the small working group of these companies who can come together, focus on the issues that matter for their operations, all moving towards this collective goal of making sure that we have better impacts in nature, and then making sure that their CEOs are aligned, I think makes for a really good structure.
So setting science-based targets, having the top-level commitment to the action and the accountability at the top. I think that's a very powerful message.
I think on TNFD it's slightly different because, of course, at the beginning it's a bunch of leaders working to design the framework. But the idea is for it to be applied and used by all corporates. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. So I think it's leaders working for the common good and making sure that the output is achievable by all corporates. That's why the feedback process is so important. And also, at the end of the day, well, it's still a voluntary framework. But if we look at the TCFD, which is a sister framework on climate, it's already mandatory in some jurisdiction. So we don't have the issue of a bunch of leaders and laggards behind.
And maybe this is really obvious, but the way you engage with companies depends on what your strategic objective is. So at Business for Nature, we're really pushing policy ambition, but also business action. If you look at the policy ambition, policymakers, you want them to hear real case examples that are the most progressive, but they also need the comfort that there is momentum, which is why more than 380... No, I'm joking. I was going to have signed make it mandatory. We've spoken about this. But anyway, no, but is the balance right? So, and then for business action, though, this is where we need to use those leading examples as examples to inspire, but the aim there is to get massive scaling and speeding up of as many possible companies, and that means using the right language to bring them along. So, you know, and I should just add, we had a workshop with our partners and some key companies we work with just in Montreal here. And a really exciting idea came up, which is that we should create a sort of joint work plan for business action all together, like one big team, so that we don't all have to try to do everything because it's impossible, and we maximize our resources and expertise in specific areas. So I think that's something we're going to go away and plan and love to get input on, because I think to scale and speed up, that's where you also reach the furthest across sectors, across geographies. And I have a little joke afterwards when we need to do a jealousy laugh for them, Matt, when we need to, you know.
So I think many of us here, we meander a little bit between the climate and nature policy worlds. And when you say how to engage the whole private sector, let's first remember, even in the climate with the Race to Zero, one of the biggest campaigns ever run globally, only 30% of the largest 2,000 companies in the world have a climate action plan. And if you look at 60,000 companies, including SMEs, guess how many of them have a climate neutrality target and an action plan? 2%. So this is a there's lots of businesses here, just great, and some of the world's biggest banks, but we're still a small subset of the world economy. How to create that social tipping point and push everybody into climate and nature action. By the way, these are not two separate things. They're fused. No Paris without nature, and also it's going to be no saving nature without drastically reducing emissions. So pushing the entire private sector needs clear policy signals. We need policy signals, and then we need pioneers who show how this can be done in a cost-effective way. And those two things have to go together. I think we're beyond where voluntary action can really, yes, I know, I keep repeating, hashtag make it mandatory, where voluntary action can trigger the change at the speed and scale that we need. So the policy signals coming out of this meeting and also out of the climate meetings are very important.
And maybe one final comment that kind of builds on Tim's point here about the importance of nature action reaching the smaller companies as well. For WBCSD, our strategy is largely to focus on the kind of third-ish of most progressive end of large companies. But what you see is a large amount, like the vast majority of their both nature and climate impact, particularly in the food sector, which I focus in, is in their supply chains. And so I think where we're getting to is for companies to be able to deliver on their climate and nature goals, they need to be working more effectively with the smaller companies that are in their supply chains on these issues. So there's a kind of way to reach them through the larger companies who are our members as well.
I think that's a good point, isn't it? That they can send the message through their upstream and downstream in their supply chains. So we're going to open up the floor for some questions. So if you ask a question, could we say, the name of obviously your name, but the name of your organisation? Remember, this is going live, so people will probably want to hear which organisation you're from. So a quick raise of hands for the first round of questions. We'll take 3 questions. And if you can say who they would be for or whether it's for the open panel. It's an expert audience, so I know you've got some tough questions. Come on.
Yes, I'm Claire Tutenuy. I'm from Entreprise pour l'Environnement, the French partner of WBCSD. So I'm part, and of course we have 60 members, large companies, among which BNP Paribas and more. Quite engaged on biodiversity. I think this panel is extremely important in this multi-stakeholder partnership. Science says things, but science is more difficult to make actually because biodiversity is so local and so on. So I think that this balance, so science will tell things, but stakeholders on the ground at big scale and small scale and local scale and sector scale will also be very important. So I think I would like to hear the panelists about this balance between science and local stakeholders and who will be the judge? How will the balances be made?
A terrific question from Pessez. Thank you for that.
Since we are between experts here.
Yes. Next question, please. Come on. There's got to be a couple.
Yes, thank you. I'm Luis Fortunato Lifanis. I'm from Mozambique. I work for the National Federation of Agrarian Associations, and I'm a focal point of environment and biodiversity. So I think we also work in the same area. We are mainstream the biodiversity in agriculture in two sectors, sugarcane industry and also soybean. So what I heard here, it's similar like what we are doing in my countries. So I don't have a question, but I would like to bring some what we are doing with the national sugar company there in Mozambique. They are now in preparation of soil. They are migrating on the electricity to the electricity instead of using gas and petrol. They got, as you know, the companies of sugar, they got too many workers. These workers were using to destroy the woods, to cook their foods. Now they are giving them the stoves of petrol, of gas and electricity to avoid them to destroy the woods, the trees for woods. Other things is also to each day they work with the workers and the association of the producers to explain them, to aware them how to do good practice while they are doing their productions. Other things, it's also to promote them to planting fruit trees in order to avoid to destroy the plant trees. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing the insights from Mozambique. And I guess there's probably a bit of a connection there between bringing the stakeholders together, applying the science, and taking things to the grassroots. And it's very encouraging that the Mozambique thrust is to decarbonise and think about biofuels and bioenergy. That's excellent if it's done in a biodiversity sensitive way. Do we have one more question, please?
Thanks. It's Jane Madgwick, CEO of Wetlands International. So first, just to appreciate the example about rice fields, because what we're really looking for is where the climate and biodiversity and people benefit comes together in whole landscapes, rather than just one producer and another producer and so on. So I think with this one, potentially we see vast landscape transformation for the better and real sizable impact. So it made me start to wonder, how can these mechanisms, albeit voluntary at the moment, actually be nudged or shoved maybe in a good direction for some of the most impactful industries I'm thinking mostly about wetland landscapes. I mean, for example, lithium mining would be a good topic where I don't think there's going to be much voluntary activity, but where there's really a need to find ways to provide incentives to change and find solutions that affect vast landscapes in a really meaningful way. Or the pulp and paper industries in Indonesia, for example, where there are forums, but progress is very slow and impacts continue. Are there ways the panel can see to really engage such sectors where there are fora and to really encourage in a very proactive way rather than waiting for the industries to come forward?
Excellent, thank you, Jane. So who would like to take or have a crack at those questions?
Thanks so much. So I'll kick off. In terms of the science, Claire, and then the stakeholders, as you know, Business for Nature is looking at a global level, so we've been very much aligned with science at a global level. But I think what's interesting when it comes to the stakeholders is that, thanks to Jeff's support also, we're now going to prepare some national implementation of the GBF, by trying to set up national business government dialogues. And that will all need to rely on science at a local level and the exchange with different stakeholders. So I think it's one of those things, is you need to get into that next level of detail at a national level where those can happen. But then maybe I'll just answer and reflect on that the last point as well from Jane. I also was thinking that what we would really need to get to now is really clear messaging and accessible messaging on what the top 5 things that any company in a specific sector should do to credibly contribute to a nature-positive world. And the reality is that there are so many different guidance and bits of information that really specific clarity is actually a campaign. It's a set of campaigns is what we would need. That there's a confidence that if you do those 5 things, you're actually investing your time and resources in the right areas. So that's something that I'd love us to, again, collectively come up with, because they need to be seen as generally accepted. And if there's a format that then it becomes the equivalent of the reduce, reuse, recycle, or whatever it is, that everyone just hammer it in, whether you're talking to WWF or to WBCSD or to whoever or to Wetlands International, we're all saying the same thing. And that's what I think is going to really shift it.
I think agriculture is, of course, the big issue in the room, not only for this convention, also for climate change. And we have to transform the way we produce and distribute and process food. And the UN Food System Summit has laid out last year some clear recommendations for that. I think the way to bring everybody together at the landscape level or at the industry level, again, is through the clear policy signals and some kind of framework that will go from here to the national governments and then play out at national level or at regional level. So we have a lot of the structures already in place, some of the roundtables on some of the key commodities, but they're not yet there to really have either the critical mass or in some cases, the rigor to really shift the needle. I just also wanted to make one point on the local action and the science. This convention has an Article 8J, on traditional ecological knowledge, which is a really important and often untapped potential for a different perspective at the local level of how you can conserve and restore biodiversity, and bringing science and traditional ecological knowledge together is often providing much better and more solid answers to key problems at the local level than just what we call science in the traditional sense. So the traditional ecological knowledge and the involvement of indigenous peoples is super critical, and luckily this convention has a specific article for doing that.
Another response perhaps on the question about local knowledge and local actors. I think in the food space there's a very much increasingly strong recognition of the importance of working closely with farmers, with indigenous communities, with local communities who are at the heart of our food systems and need to be in a position to drive the changes needed. And this is like an increasing amount of airtime within the conversations about how to within the business community about how to drive change and how to best work with the farmers that they source from. In terms of how that reflects in our work, we are working increasingly closely with the World Farmers Organization in particular, but other farmers groups as well. So, for example, SACAO, the Southern African Farmers Group, is on the advisory board of the Just Rural Transition Initiative, which is another of the projects that I'm involved in. And we are one of the key partners in a new initiative called Regen 10 that's looking to scale regenerative agriculture around the world. this is again another multi-stakeholder partnership involving a range of different organizations, including IUCN, who are working closely with indigenous groups, World Farmers Organization, also the Food and Land Use Coalition, and Meridian Institute. So it's a range of different partners. But that project is very much taking the line of we have to. The first step has to be working with farmers to better understand what they see as the priorities and making sure that feeds in. And at the very beginning, we get very clear messaging from the farming communities that if business develops a framework and then expects them to implement it at the end, it's too late. Like this has to be a conversation that starts from the very beginning. So definitely, I think we're still figuring out how to do that, but increasing priority is working together from the planning stages.
I think food systems, perhaps more than any other economic system, you really start to get into the culture of food and not just the science, right?
If I may be a little bit more precise on this food system, I would really rebound on your word of cultural, and you are more talking about cultural on the farmer side, but there was more thinking about cultural on the consumer side, because so far, sort of the last 50 years of agricultural revolution have really led to extremely few species, an extremely standardized food system. And so the question is more, if you want to raise biodiversity or be nature positive, in a way it would need to go a little bit in different direction of more local food, more adapted to consumer local taste or local traditions, not only on farmer side. And so it's really, I think, a huge challenge for the food business, for the large companies that do the food business today, to reincorporate this biodiversity based on local cultures and so on. So I was wondering if this is starting more, as well as on the upside supply chain side.
Yeah, I think there's a growing conversation about consumption patterns as well, and the need to shift diets. I think it's not just about kind of what's the item, but also about like the ingredients that go into other things, and kind of how you source from a wide range of different inputs into processed food as well. But yeah, definitely the consumption end is definitely an important part of the conversation as well.
One of the interesting points is the EAT Foundation. People are familiar with the EAT Foundation. They put out the EAT Lancet report. Next year there'll be the EAT 2.0, which will have country-specific targets for diet. So recognising that there are some opportunities there to really flesh that out and devise locally led solutions for diets. Laurence, we were talking about smallholders, big French bank. What are you doing with the smaller end, the unbankable end?
Yes, thank you for the question, Matt. We've just launched a new coalition, which is called the Just Institute, together with the GEF and the Credit Agricole Foundation. So it's still a nascent coalition, but the purpose is to address the nexus of social inclusion, climate and biodiversity, starting at the very end of the value chain with smallholder farmers who usually borrow money from microfinance institutions. They suffer a decrease of their yields due to biodiversity loss and climate change, so they're in trouble to reimburse their loans. So the idea is to draft a certification scheme together with IFAD and to be able to identify the share of the portfolio of the microfinance institution which is financing nature-based solutions, which will attract, of course, the funders. So it's a very beginning. It's a pilot phase we're doing with microfinance institution, but we're convinced that it's very promising, transforming, and well, it's a call to action because it's not a VIP club. We want to be as many as possible around the table. And I think it's very relevant for players active, of course, in the agri-food, for big retailers, for wholesalers, traders, in order to really transform the value chain, starting by the smallholder farmers.
So, can you give us the name of the initiative again, please,
It's
Laurence?
a Just Institute, Just from Just Transition, of course.
Very good, thank you. And Katie, perhaps you can have the last word from our panel. I know there are a couple of people who you want to get a question in. You've been looking at me saying you want to get a question in. Go on.
Yeah, I'm Eva de Keizer from Alpro Danone, so also in the food business. That's why I really want to ask my questions, because you speak a lot about how you involve the multi-stakeholders, but what I also see in food, it's a bit related, like there is a lot of opinion in consumers, which makes it difficult also as a business that you have to take into account everything you need to do, science-based, but then you have everything that consumers expect that maybe lives somewhere that is not always correct. So I wanted to ask, when you speak about joining your forces and making a good plan for businesses, do you also take into account bringing that to the public and vulgarizing that in that sense? Because if what you are explaining here with all the language is already complex for businesses, how will we ever bring it to consumers and to the general public?
With fashion, yeah. No, I think that that's a great point, and I think consumers, they're asking for simplicity and they're asking for sustainability, right? And I think a lot of the storytelling that we can do from a local context to bring that to consumers is really powerful, but to do it in a meaningful way and in a simple way to make sure you can keep up with the demand of, you know, those 2-minute videos online, make sure you're relevant. You know, I think it's a challenge, but I think it's one that the fashion industry, given that they already have a lot of brand loyalty with their customers, is one that is really looking at doing a lot of exciting things. A couple months ago, we launched a really unique partnership with Burberry and Minecraft. Is an example of a way to reach new consumers. So they launched a line that had a Minecraft capsule. And as part of that launch, they also launched a Minecraft game. And the whole goal behind the game is to restore 4 realms back to balance: earth, wind, fire, and air. And as part of that launch, you know, we worked with them to really engage consumers or gamers, I should say, to protect an acre. So come to CI, help us protect forests, protect an acre, and then you get these little character skins for your Minecraft character. So that's just one example I can think of, ways of how to get that kind of really detailed science stuff simplified for your average consumer like myself.
Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. With the noise next door, did you say Minecraft meets Burberry, and you've got all these little people in Minecraft wearing Burberry?
Yes, yes, I did. And there is also Burberry sweaters that have the Minecraft logos on them. Which,
interesting.
Yes.
I would be very keen to see how that, you know, it's a bit of a clash, but great. No judgment there. Actually, what it made me think of was your point that I never came back to, but then with the other point there, and because I was taking a time to reflect on soil health and all of these things that you were talking about, and it comes back actually to values and valuing nature. And when you want to understand other stakeholders, you may have the physical numbers of how much water you used, or you know what the emissions are, but and what the soil health is, but then different people value different things in different ways, and so that's where the richness of decision making comes in, when you've actually fully valued that. You don't want my joke?
What? Go.
Are you waiting for it?
We want to hear.
Okay, I'll do it now. It's not very good, but it's just to laugh. So we, you know, so when you want to meet someone, and you're a bit embarrassed, it's the first time you meet them, it's always a really good idea to talk to them about global warming, because it's a real icebreaker.
Oh, very good. That's one straight out of the Christmas cracker, that one. I'll remember that one. Yeah. Well, we'll leave on those smiley notes. I would like to thank our panel here today for sharing their insights we're all part of many of these platforms, so we're always going to be following them. And let's get back together at COP16, and you can tell us how more successful these multi-stakeholder partnerships have become. So please, everybody, a round of applause for our audience and our panelists. Thank you very much. That was a nice conversation.